Hello and welcome to this iron raft self-build tutorial. In the last video I showed you how to seal these front seams and we glued all the insides of the seams. In this video I'll be showing you how to seal the tubing to the floor and how to seal the strips to the floor. Okay, so to seal this main section of the tube first, you're going to want to get a box to put inside to hold the tube up so that you can align it nicely and free up your hands. This box is about 19 centimeters tall. The tubes have a 30 centimeter diameter, so 19 works nicely because it's not stretching the fabric right to its full height. Additionally, you're going to want some of your paper weights or weights of any kind to place the fabric where you want it to be before you seal it. Okay, so I'm going to start with the long section in the middle. I've folded that over and I've got my box inside. Now what you want to do is align each end as accurately as possible up with the other side of the tube, and what you'll get is the strip down the middle just butts up to each other nicely, and then I've weighed them down with free weights. Okay, so once you're happy that you've got it all aligned in position and weighed down securely, the process is you can roll up this end a little bit and you're going to reach in, and like you did when you're sealing it to the floor in the first place, you start from the halfway point and iron out towards the edge. Inside you'll notice there is a line drawn onto the fabric about 3 centimeters, and that's a guideline of how far you should be ironing. So try to stick to that line, and you can go over the seam, partially go over part of the seam that you've already sealed to the floor, and that's just going to make sure that you've got a good seal there as well. Okay, so when you iron within the tube, just be really careful of yourself, not to burn yourself, and where the iron's touching other sections of the tube, because you don't want to leave it to heat up hot enough that it will melt the TP on this side. So start aiming for the center of the seam, and at this point you can use the iron quite flat and just slowly work your way towards the end of the seam. And you can move your weights out the way as you get to them. Continue sealing up to that line. Once you get to the joint where the seam comes in, you want to do what you did before and leave approximately 2 centimeters unsealed at that end, so you've got room to seal the seam down when we get to that stage. And you can use the marking that's already there from last time. Now I've gone over quite quickly and that's tacked it in place, so I'm going to go over a second time and make sure I've got a nice straight edge up against that line. I'll probably use more of the edge of the iron for this bit. But again, just working towards the end of the tube, ironing in one direction. And once you're happy, you've ironed that, and it's got a good seal with minimal wrinkles, then you're going to go round to the other end of the tube and you're going to do the same, working from the centre to this end. Okay, so I've just turned the boat around so we can get a better view of this seam joint we're going to do now. You've got the 2 centimetre tab that you've left unsealed there. That's where your seam's going to join up with exactly the same technique that you used to seal it before, where you fold it over, but I'll show you that next. First though, you want to check that this next section is going to sit in its position as it should. And once we've done the seam, that's going to be sealed in exactly the same way as we've just sealed that other tube. Okay, so I'm just going to cut the excess seam fabric, you see here. As I said before, we're going to fold that over, so you're going to want to cut it approximately 1 centimetre where it passes the end of the tube fabric. So we'll see about here. Okay, so as you can see, I've lined this up and weighted it in its position, and now that's in position, I've folded over my tab and aligned it centrally in between, and now that's central in between the join there, and you've still got an overlap there that you can heat seal down. You folded it over, you're going to heat seal that in place. Be very careful with the iron. Just going to tack it down on top first. And now I'm going in to seal these tabs. As before, I'm going to get the iron right up to the seam that's created a bit of a ledge that you can push up against. And if you need to reposition anything, you can still reposition it when the TPU is still warm. Just be careful you don't burn your fingers. So you see I've just lifted that bit up because it hadn't properly sealed yet. Just a bit difficult doing this and leaving room for the camera. So ensure that's lined up. Okay, at this point you'll notice it's stuck to the floor, but we've still got to seal the last bit of the seam to the tube, which we'd left unsealed at the previous step. And as before, you want to be careful not to put your heat just on the tube, just on the seam joint. So you choose the very tip of your iron to seal that. If you're worried about touching or heating up the TPU on the other side, you can put a bit of baking paper under here so it doesn't stick to the floor. Okay, so now that's held in place quite well down there with the solid seal. I've realigned this and that will align up once it's sat flat. I'm going to go back and I'm going to get rid of any wrinkles in there and ensure that there's a good seal all the way along to this end, leaving your little gap for the seam at this end, just like we have done before. As before, we're using the line marked on the fabric to iron up to. I'm going once along to seal it in place. And then I'll go back to make sure it's got a good seal right up to the edge. And I'm pushing right down on the edge of the iron here to try and get a nice straight line. Okay, so we're going to do the same process of sealing the tubing to the floor, leaving a gap, then sealing the strip and continuing with the next section. I've done this section and this section so far, so I've got the end section to do, section here and a section there. Okay, so I'm now going to show you what to do in a troubleshooting situation. Where you've attached a seam, if the end of the tube pieces don't align perfectly, you see here we have a small difference. That's going to cause a slight problem, and I'm going to show you how to deal with that. Okay, so as before, we're going to fold over the 1 centimeter tab, and I'm going to put this piece in its place. Now that's central over the seam, and we've got a tab here to seal down in front. But when you come to put the other piece in place, you get all these wrinkles, and we're not going to be able to seal that because it's too much of a wrinkle. So what you want to do is, with this piece in place as we've just put it, we'll then align this end to where it wants to be, so aligned with the join there. I'm going to weight that down in place, and then you're going to pull this section to wherever it needs to be to let that join lie flat so you can get a good seal on it. So where it is now, we're aligned at this end, we're aligned at this end, and we've got a flat surface to seal the join of the seam. But what it does mean is this is overlapping on this. So what I'm going to do is take a pen, I'm going to place it up against the ridge that is formed where the edge of this is, and I'm going to draw a line up against that ridge, and that should give you a relatively straight line, and that's going to be your cut line. And that's going to solve the problem of sealing this flat and sealing that flat and sealing that flat. Okay, so I'm just going to cut along that line. Don't worry too much about the cut because it's going to be completely out of sight. And once you've cut out that triangle, you can then align this end, weight that down in place, align this end, and that should now give you everything now in alignment, ready to seal it down. Okay, so I'm now going to heat seal this seam down and this join. Where you left the last section of the seam unsealed, you're going to want to put some baking paper underneath, just so you can seal that without worrying that the heat's going to go through. As before, push right up to the edge of the seam, and then you can just go on top of it and then seal the tab in front of it. And remember to leave your gap, 2 centimetre gap at the end, put the seam in. Okay, so I've now been over again with the heat sealing iron to neaten it up and seal right up to the edges and get a good seal there. And as you can see, although we started with an error and this is a troubleshooting process, the finished seam is not bad. Additionally, we'll be going over with acma glue on this last section just to ensure there's no pinhole leaks. Okay, so I'm working around the boat and I've just sealed this seam here down, and I've sealed from about halfway, as you can see, pushing towards that, and that's all sealed up nicely. I'm now going to do this seam, and I'm just going to show you again on camera as there's better access for the camera on this position. Okay, so I've put this in position here and I'm just holding it in place with my finger. As before, exactly the same process. We've folded over the strip at the end, and the fold wants to be in the direction that there's TPU downwards to the floor, and then you've got the TPU upwards to the tube here. So it's always TPU to TPU. That's centrally aligned on the seam, so you've got roughly the same amount of seam on each piece of the tube, and they're both going to sit in their place in the corner. Once the iron comes along here, that's going to push that down into place. So I'm working my way from the center to the end of the seam, and again I'm ironing up to this line that is marked on there. Just gonna tack it into place, and then I'll go back and neaten that up afterwards. Now we're gonna up against the edge of the seam, push up with the edge of the iron, and that'll put that in place. Once that's done, I'm going to move on to the top of it and iron the tube pieces onto the seam. Always be cautious of what your iron's doing on this fabric. Never leave it in one place for too long because it'll start to transfer the heat through. So that seam is tacked into place, and now I'm going to move to the front and make sure you've got a nice tab here that's going to seal that down. Again, I'm using the corner of the iron to get a good seal on that. And go back on top. Just work your way around each edge, making sure it's sealed right up to it to ensure it's airtight. Once it's firmly held in place, you can then go back over it and get out any creases, air bubbles, and make sure it's sealed right up to the very edge. So that's one side of that seam done. I'm going to move on to this section. Ensuring this is lined up here. These pieces are butted up to each other. pushing the iron up to the edge of the seam. I'm going to move to the front, tack that into place. So now that's held in place, I'm going to go over it, push out any air bubbles, creases, and make sure it's nicely aligned and got a good proper seal. It's just held in place at the moment. Okay, so I've just been over with the iron and gotten out any creases there were. I've also sealed right up to the line here to ensure it's nice and neat. As you can see, I haven't managed to align it absolutely perfect and get these two edges butted completely up to each other. This isn't a problem as long as you've got a good seal on the edge along here. For added reassurance, we will go over with Aquasure to make sure you haven't got any minute leaks coming through here. Okay, so now we've sealed all the tube pieces to the floor and we've sealed the bottom of the seam in this junction point. We're going to put a line of Aquasure just running across, because where all these sections join, it can be quite difficult to get it perfectly aligned and perfectly airtight. So if we start the Aquasure just where we left off in the previous step and run it across this seam to the other side to join up with the Aquasure there. We want to pay close attention to this central spot where everything is meeting, because that's really a difficult part to get airtight with just heat sealing alone. So we're going to use a similar amount of Aquasure to what we did on the seams. If you haven't managed to align it as well in the center, then you may need to use a little bit more in this area that I'm doing now. It's better to use more if you're unsure, because once the Packraft tubes are sealed up, you're not going to be able to get in here and rectify any problems that you might have. So if in doubt, use a little bit additional on these junction points. Okay, so I'm now going to go around all the junction points in the tubing and do exactly the same with Aquasure that I've just showed you. What's helpful is to put in some boxes. You can use the box that you used when you were sealing the tubing to the floor, and that just holds it up, so you don't have to be holding the fabric up. You can just stick one arm in and do it, and then you need them in there anyway to hold the fabric up while the glue sets overnight. Okay, so if you remember, this seam I didn't align very well, and we've ended up with these little gaps in between pieces of fabric where ideally we'd like them to butt perfectly up to each other. And that's created a tiny little gap here. Now that's going to be a potential leaking spot, so we need to pay close attention to make sure that we seal that nicely with the Aquasure. Okay, so that's it for this stage. We're going to leave that glue to set overnight, so you need to make sure you put your boxes in a position where they're not going to fall over and let the fabric fall onto itself, because you'll end up with it glued to each other. So once you're happy that that's secure, you can leave that for the night to dry. Okay, so I've now let the Aquasure dry overnight. I'm now going to put some baby powder on top of the Aquasure just to prevent it from sticking to itself when you fold up the Packraft, and that's really important to prevent damage. So in this next stage, we're going to connect reinforcement strips between the tubing and the floor. Thanks for watching this Iron Raft self-build tutorial. Click on the next video to see that now.